Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly InfoSec Seminar organized by the Information Systems Security and Assurance Management Department in Mihelshan School of Management. Before we start, I have two quick announcements. The first one is that our convocation ceremonies will be held on Saturday, May 28, and faculty members are reminded to attend. And on this link, you can find more details. The second one is that the Faculty of Management is recruiting and individuals are invited to attend the research and teaching demonstration of candidates. And more information can be found online on this link. So please try to attend and ask questions. Now let's go to our talk. So today we are very pleased to have one of our brilliant alumni, Aman Dharni, to give us an interesting talk about components of IT audit, understanding the IT audit process. Aman is a consultant with KPMG's Technology Risk Consulting practice. Aman has handled multiple IT audit engagement for SOX and JSOX compliance projects. Aman also working as a risk transformation analyst with Big Four firm, SAP GRC and SAP Access Control implementation and post-implementation support projects. Prior to joining KPMG, Aman was a sessional instructor at Concordia University of Edmonton and taught forensic accounting and fraud examination. Aman's educational background includes a Master of Information Systems Assurance Management, where his research was focused on allowing Canadian banks to adhere to privacy law by BIDA and GDPR using COVID 2019 framework. Thanks, Aman, for being with us today, and thank you all for attending the seminar. For our guests from outside Concordia University of Edmonton, please register in this form. I will share it with you in the chat area to get your attendance certificate. This is only for those who use email addresses from outside Concordia. Thanks, Aman, and it's all yours now.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Eslam. First off, I want to thank Dr. Eslam, Dr. Sean Agili, and Professor Sean Thompson for allowing me to present today. So before I start, I will also tell you a little bit about myself in addition to what Dr. Eslam stated. I have background in computer science. My undergrad was in computer science, and then I worked with EY as a risk analyst, where my focus was mainly on ERP system access controls. I worked 18 months there before I came to Canada in 2018. Finished my MISAM degree in 2020. And last year, I got the opportunity to work with KPMG as a technology risk consultant, where I perform IT audits, and my main focus lies on SOC report reviews, reviewing general IT controls and IT automated controls, and making sure that our clients are SOX compliant. And this is what my presentation is going to be about. I'll give you a brief introduction about the IT auditing process, and as a current cohort of Concordia University, or if you are graduating soon, what you can look for if this is the field you want to get into. Let me start by sharing my screen. And Dr. Eslam, please, can you tell me if my presentation is all right? Yes. So let's start understanding the IT audit process. So the agenda of my presentation today is going to be to introduce you to the auditing that is involved in my work, the actual IT audit process, the challenges faced by me personally, and like the common challenges in this industry, current and future opportunities according to me, like if this is a field you can get into, if it's a good idea to get into this industry, And then we will finish by any questions that you might have in the end. So part one would be introduction to IT audit. What's an IT audit? Identify the criteria for IT audit involvement in an audit engagement. And by audit engagement, I mean the actual finance audit that is being performed for all the companies, more importantly for companies that are publicly listed. And then how IT audit gets involved in that. And finally, role of an IT auditor. So what is an audit? Going by the official definition here, it is an independent examination of financial information of any entity, whether profit-oriented or not, irrespective of its size or legal form, when such an examination is conducted with a view to express an opinion thereon. So what this means is this holds more importance, especially if you're a publicly listed company. Let's say you are a potential stock owner, or you want to own stocks in a company, or you already own a good amount of stocks in a company. You want to know if your investment is safe with that entity or not. So an audit ensures that a company is performing all of its business processes as they state they are, and then their financial statements, which they share publicly, are accurate or not. So it is the job of an auditor to make sure that anything expressed by an entity is true, and any potential shareholder or existing shareholder are not in the dark if anything goes wrong with the company. So the objective of a financial audit of financial statements by the independent auditor is the expression of an opinion on the fairness with which they present all material respects, financial positions, results of operations, cash flows, which should be in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles. And a job of an auditor is not to provide absolute assurance, but reasonable assurance that the business processes are working as intended, and whatever is being shared publicly by an organization holds true. Now, that is the definition of an audit, but what is an IT audit? So in recent years, especially after 1980s, entities have shifted their focus from manual work to automating and improving efficiencies. So how do you improve efficiency in your organization? You automate the processes, and the process automation is done by IT systems. So adopting and implementing new technology and automating your processes can lead to various risks, like incorrect processing or migration of data. If you are implementing a new system or replacing an old system to improve efficiency, maybe the new system is not working as intended. It is giving you the wrong output. Or your IT system, the access is not configured correctly. Someone who should not be gaining access to your system reaches your system and corrupts your data. Or the system access within your employees is not in line with the job responsibilities. So with increasing reliance to IT systems, these risks can affect your business processes and cause huge damage to your company's performance. And it is IT audit. It is a job of an IT auditor to investigate any reliance to IT systems and make sure they are working as intended. So an IT audit is an investigation of IT systems infrastructure and operations, and making sure that entities' IT systems are commensurate with entities' IT policies and goals. And we're going to start with the audit process first. And here I mean the complete audit process, not just the IT process. So how this goes is, first off, we start with the risk assessment. We meet with our client and we discuss how their business processes are being performed end to end. And then we look at the pressure points to see if any areas can lead to material misstatement. And by material misstatement here, I mean any mistakes or any improper flow of information that can cause mistakes in the financial statements and um, lead to wrong information being put forth to the public. Then, after we identify those pressure points, we design our audit procedures around those to make sure that those pressure points do not lead to any material misstatement. And if they do, then there are mitigating procedures to prevent that. So after designing those audit procedures are then performed, and the results of those tests are evaluated, and an opinion is issued, which basically states if whatever the company is saying or issuing to the public is accurate or not. So, what would be the criteria for audit involvement in a complete or in a general audit? So, the nature and extent of an IT audit's participation on any financial audit, or in a general term, I'm going to say interchangeably use financial audit or audit, but it's going to mean the same thing. So, the extent of IT audit's participation in any financial audit may vary depending upon the entity's reliance on their IT systems, and then risks arising from those IT systems, and then for those risks, if they lead to material misstatement or not. For example, I have a very good local example. Like recently, 5 years ago, Amazon started constructing its warehouse in Leduc. It is a 1 million square foot fulfillment center for picking, packing, and shipping items to customers, and currently employs more than 2,000 full-time workers. And of course, at any given time, they have millions of dollars of worth of goods in their warehouse. So, apart from the general IT, apart from general audit procedures that will be performed, if you look from an IT aspect, since there will be reliance on IT system, what kind of risks arise in such a scenario? I can think of 3 risks that can arise in that warehouse. Number one being items being incorrectly read by their scanners, and then a false entry being created for items coming in or going out. And then if a false entry is being created, then that raises the risk of incorrect items being shipped out to the customers. And then the third risk that I can think of is anybody who is monitoring those systems, are they actually um, smart enough or competent enough to use those systems correctly or not? So these are the 3 IT risks that one could face in this instance. So how does an IT audit comes into play? Like once we have a meeting with the client, and let's say from an IT perspective, we found these risks to be quite relevant in the business process, we will look at how the item comes into the warehouse, being stored into the system, the stock being updated, and then the item going out, the stock being updated again, the item reaching the customer, and then the person who is in charge of the IT system, which maintains all the item stocks, which could run into millions of items worth millions of dollars. So as an IT auditor, once we understand this process end to end, for instance, me as a consultant, I would pick, let's say, 100 transactions throughout the week. And let's assume the price of those items for those 100 samples is $100,000. I would see that once those items are imported into the warehouse, the stock is being updated correctly in the systems. Once they are being delivered to the customers, the correct item is being delivered and the stocks are again being correctly taken out from the system. And then the employees who are in charge of taking the items in and updating the stock are not the same employees who are taking the items out to deliver. And there is a supervision between a person reconciling all the items coming in and going out and maintaining the stock correctly, which should not be the same person as well. So, for instance, for those 100 samples, let's say $10,000 worth of goods were not correctly delivered, maybe because they were not correctly scanned or incorrect item was sent out. That means during my test, I found out that 10% of the entire items going in or out are not being correctly handled. So, what does this mean for Amazon? If in a month they are delivering $1 million worth of goods, right, and 10% of them are not being delivered correctly, that means $100,000 worth of goods are not being handled in a correct manner in a month. And then if you add that to the whole year or one audit period, which is usually 1 year, that leads to $1.2 million worth of goods not being delivered or not being updated correctly in the systems, which means for their balance sheets, the stocks are not being correctly maintained, and the information that Amazon put forth to its stockholders is not correct. So $1.2 million might or might not be a huge amount depending on the business. But I'm going to assume in our example, like 1.2 million is a big amount for Amazon to not ignore, and this could lead to material misstatement in their balance sheets. So this is how IT audit comes into play. Apart from all the manual processes that are being done, some sort of automation is always there in every organization, and it is our job as IT auditors to make sure that the IT systems are running as intended. If not, we find the deficiencies and report it to the business. That was my example. And in an audit, when do IT auditors get involved? So our job is to assist the audit team in understanding how transactions flow through an entity's IT system. So the example I gave for Amazon warehouse, it is our job to explain to the IT audit personnel who might have expertise in finance, but not necessarily in IT systems, like how those IT system works, how the stocks are being updated, and how access to those IT systems are only being given to correct individuals, and no one from another department, let's say no one from HR, can play with the stock count of the items that are in the warehouse. So we act as a liaison between the audit team and the IT team of the client and explain how the business processes work to the audit team. So it is our job to identify which of the client's IT systems are relevant to financial reporting, identify risk points within the entity's business processes. Again, as I explained in my example, identify risks arising from IT systems. And then for those IT risks, are there relevant automated controls or general IT controls in place? Evaluate the design of those controls and test the operating effectiveness of those controls as well. So what does an IT auditor brings in to the audit table? We increase the quality of opinion by performing a high quality audit that is based on appropriate audit evidence, which also includes and incorporates IT systems. Quality of insight increases by improving the reporting to clients and giving them an insight on how to better manage their IT systems. Quality of execution also improves by increasing the understanding of the flow of information, including the IT systems, and design an efficient and effective audit approach that considers a combination of manual controls that are dealt by the audit team and the audit controls that are dealt by the IT audit team. Moving on, I will now talk about the IT process. So we discussed the audit process, of which the IT audit process forms a subset. And in that IT audit process, I will cover understanding the IT environment, how do entity use IT systems, IT system and layers, risk of material misstatement, process risk point and relevant controls, risk arising from IT, general IT controls, control testing techniques, performing walkthroughs, and reporting deficiencies. So the first step for an IT audit for us is to understand the IT environment. We go to the client and we ask them to define how they use their IT systems, how the IT system affect the flow of transaction, and if they are in any manner tied to their financial reporting. So we find the link between the IT systems and the financial reporting process to understand the dependency of the financial statements on IT processes, the layers of technologies involved in IT, and for those layers, what kind of risks can arise. And then there are identifying pressure process risk points that can trigger those risks. And then finally, general IT controls or automated controls involved in the business environment. So how do entities use IT systems? During our initial conversation with the client, find how client uses IT systems to maintain their financial records, operate their business, and then report financial results both internally and externally. After this, we establish what percentage of the business processes are manual and what percentage is automated. So what this means is management can either have limited reliance to IT systems and process business transactions manually, where the controls are more manual in nature. For example, um, a controller is manually entering journal entries on a piece of paper and then maintaining it in their repository. But that is not the case now since the exponential adoption of IT systems. What happens is entities automate certain processes and control activities to enhance efficiency and effectiveness. So management may make use of IT systems such as enterprise resource planning systems, where a controller will have access to post journal entries, which is done electronically, and then it is saved either locally with the clients within the client servers or on the cloud. And if it's so here, automation is involved since the system is doing all the processing. This is where the IT audit comes into picture. So continuing on, how do entities use IT systems? We look at why are IT systems incorporated into financial reporting. Why are they incorporated? Entities may use systems to mitigate risks, and entities often use IT systems to improve efficiency. As I said, processing and aggregating large amount of information cannot be done manually and might consume a lot of human effort and require a lot of human intervention, and that raises the risk for human errors for day-to-day tasks that can be automated. Entities often use IT systems to help prevent departments from working in silos. For instance, now ERP systems like SAP or Oracle are being used to incorporate multiple departments like finance, controlling, material management, HR, sales, quality assurance, etc., so that managers from each department have some sort of transparency on how the business processes are being executed, and the employees get a certain idea like how they are part of the bigger footprint, which in turn leads them not working in silos. And then entities use multiple software now for financial reporting. So this is how majorly IT systems are incorporated today. So for these IT systems, we look at 4 layers. application, database, OS, and network. So the application layers can perform one or many functions, tasks, and activities to capture, process, or extract information. And this is the layer typically used by end users. The database layer is where the organization stores most of its data and information, which can be used for easiest access. Then we get to the OS layer, which controls the basic operation of the computer, provides a software platform on which to run other software such as applications and hold the database. The OS layer is not typically used by the end user. And then we have the network for communication within the company, outside the organization, and within the employees. So after gaining an understanding of the IT environment, the reliance of the client on its IT controls, how the different layers are configured, we classify the risk of material misstatement, process risk points, and the relevant controls that address those risk points for the IT environment. So moving on, IT systems have layer-specific risks. So while understanding the entities control activities that cover process risk points, which reduce, by knowing the process risk points, you can reduce the risk of material misstatement. The auditors obtains an understanding of how the entity responds to those risk points by having an IT control in place. So for that IT control, we look at risks arising from IT. So as an IT auditor, we identify the IT system layers where the automated control activity exists, and identify the risks arising from IT where that control is preventing the pressures coming from the process risk point. So for example, system generated report, an entity may have reliance on a financial statement coming from a system generated report, which is an IT process, but that report may or may not be accurate. So the risk arising from that report not being accurate is what we need to look into during our testing of general IT controls. So when we look at IT controls, we look at risks arising from IT. They can be categorized into 4 domains. Number 1 is access to program and data. Here, the risk that access to programs and data is unauthorized or appropriate is what we need to remediate. This can be in various forms. Like the organization is not restricting access appropriately to its employees. Let's say somebody from HR has access to the finance department, and what they can essentially do is they can change the salaries being paid, or can cause problems to the business process involved in salaries going out to the employees. Another risk that we look at in this domain is for new employees coming in, is their access appropriate or not? For an employee moving within different departments, is their previous access removed and then new access has been reviewed? And then for employees that leave the organization, was their access removed on time? Let's say I left the organization on 1st May, but I still had access to the system till May 30th. I could have done a lot of data extraction and shared confidential company information after I left the company without any repercussions, because I was not liable to follow my company policy since I'm no longer an employee. So access to program and data, we have to carefully look at a lot of things to make sure that business processes are being conducted in a safe and secure manner. Next would be program changes. So the number one thing about incorporating IT in your business processes is that IT systems never remain constant. There is always a new vulnerability, excuse me. For IT systems, vulnerabilities are being identified, if not every hour, I would say every day. And organizations are trying to make sure that they are up to date with their security protocols. So the IT systems need to be updated or modified um, fairly many times in a, let's say, in a week or a month. So how do we ensure that the IT system where the changes are being made, are they being made correctly or not? So this is the domain here in program changes. The risk that changes to existing systems, IT applications are unauthorized, untested, unapproved, or improperly implemented or documented. So this is the risk we need to look at in this domain. So if I am updating my system, I need to make sure that first I test the update in my dev environment or test environment and make sure that it is not causing any trouble with the relating business processes and the business is running smoothly after the update or after the program change. If I add a new functionality to an IT program, I need to make sure that the previous functionality is working as intended and the new functionality does not cause problems to the already existing processes. And then the third thing is whoever is making changes to the IT systems, is there a way, is there an audit log being maintained on who made the changes, who approved the changes? And in case the changes did not act as intended, was there any remediation or backup plan to roll over those changes so that the business is not disrupted? So program changes forms a huge part of IT audit, and we as IT auditors need to make sure that this process is being followed correctly, and then there is segregation between um, approving the changes and putting them directly into the production before. So we need to make sure that they are being tested in the dev environment first. The third domain is program acquisition and development. So as companies look to improve efficiency in their business processes, they acquire new programs, they acquire new functionalities into their existing programs, and they implement them to increase efficiency. So let's say if I was using an old legacy system yesterday and now I want to implement Oracle into my business processes to first off make it user friendly to current and new employees and to increase the efficiency and the speed of my processing. So once I acquire Oracle, I need to make sure that the output being given by the Oracle functions is similar to the functions that it replaced from the legacy programs. So whenever a new program is being implemented, we as IT auditors need to make sure we need to look at data sets from the old program and compare it with the new program to make sure that the output is correct. And again, whatever access employees had with the old program, similar access is being provided to the new program, and then there is no leakage of access. That is the third domain of what kind of risk can arise from IT if a new system is being implemented. And lastly, this is the fourth domain, which is computer operations. The risks that IT system processing is unauthorized or inappropriately scheduled, and deviations from scheduled processing are unidentified and unresolved. So you must have studied during your disaster recovery planning that you need to have a contingency plan if your systems shut down, if there is a power outage, or if there is a natural disaster. So what computer operations does is we need to look at the contingency plans, the backup logs of an organization, and make sure they're working as intended with respect to their uh, disaster recovery management policies. So we take a look at the physical access to the server rooms, make sure that only appropriate employees are given access to server rooms. Secondly, the backups are being planned in a timely manner. And then third, we test the backups to make sure that in case of an emergency, the backups are capable of resuming business on time. So that comes under computer operations. So risks arising from IT that we just discussed, there are 4 domains. How are those risks addressed? Those risks are addressed by general IT controls and IT automated controls. So GITCs enable automated control activities to work properly when first developed and implemented, and continue to function properly after they are implemented. And this is why entities incorporate IT into their businesses, because once you set up an IT process, it remains the same. You just need to give it a few tweaks here and there, maybe after a few months. But if you set it up correctly, you can reduce human interaction, human intervention, and human errors. And once it has been set up, your business processes run smoothly without any risk of material misstatement. So GITCs are policies and procedures that relate to one or more IT applications and help ensure that anybody who are using the IT system access is granted, so right people have access to the right things. IT systems function as intended, data is processed as intended, and then the IT systems support the completeness and accuracy of system generated reports, interfaces, and reduce the risk that data is being modified by minimizing human interaction with the systems. And it is important to note that ineffective GITCs may lead to automatic controls not being working consistently, and therefore they might not be able to detect or prevent material misstatements in an organization. So once we talk with the client, once we find out their reliance to the IT systems, and once for those IT systems, we look at the 4 domains where the risks can arise from, we start with our testing and we start with our walkthroughs. But before we go over with what a walkthrough entails, let me explain you our testing techniques. So we have 4 testing techniques that we follow during our IT audit. It is inquiry, observation, inspection, and reperformance. So inquiry involves asking the person responsible performing that business activity, like how they perform that control and what they look for when they're performing that control. And if there is an exception, how do they deal with the exception? In observation, we look at the process or procedures being performed by others. For example, the client tells us that there is an automated process, like for any sales order less than $1,000, they are being approved automatically. But for anything over $1,000, it goes to person X. For anything over $10,000, it goes to person Y. So during observation, we look at those business processes and see for any order exceeding $1,000, is it actually going to person X? Any order exceeding $10,000, is it actually going to person Y? So on and so forth. And similar to this example, whatever business processes that are being defined by the client to us, we observe them, we observe every instance, not multiple instances, but at least one instance of each business process to make sure that it is working as intended. And then during inspection, we obtain evidence to corroborate the inquiries that we made earlier. This evidence is used for documentation. And then we also evaluate the effectiveness of the control as implemented by the control operator. So here we look at the competency of the person performing that job. During our inspection, we might say that the system is configured correctly, but the person using that system, is he competent enough to make sure that he's following the policies correctly, and if the output being given by the system, is he able to identify any outliers or any exceptions to the problem. And finally, we do a reperformance. Wherever we find pressure points in the business process, we try to re-perform those processes by ourselves. As I explained earlier, during observation, let's say the client told us that for $1,000 and over, the sales order goes to approval to person X. For $10,000 and over, the sales order approval goes to person Y. Now, there is a risk point here that if person X moves to another designation, should the approval still be going to him or her or no? So we come back after 3 months, we reperform the control, and let's say we observe that person X moved to a new department, so they no longer should be approving the sales order. Let's say they move to HR, they no longer should be approving the sales order. But we see that someone else was given the authority to approve orders over $1,000. And we gain assurance that even though there were some changes in the business process, steps were taken to make sure that the design was not affected. And this is what we do during our reperformance to make sure that during the year, randomly, if there were any changes to the personnel or the design of the control, if it affects the output or not. And in this instance, we make sure that if somebody leaves the organization or if somebody changes department, in the sales order example, now the approvals are going to the new person or not, and if they are competent enough to process those approvals. So in summary, if I define what a process risk point is, it is a point in the business process at which an error could occur. And what would be a RAFID? So risk arising from IT would be risks that could affect the effective operation of automated control activities or the integrity of data and information within an entity's IT system. So process risk point is identified when we obtain an understanding of the business processes, when it is explained to us by the client. And risks arising from IT is identified during our walkthroughs, when we look at the automated controls and see if they're addressing the risks correctly or not. And then process risk point is addressed by manual or automated control activities, and risks arising from IT are addressed by general IT controls. Now, this is a major part of our IT audit is performing the walkthroughs. This is our bread and butter. So the primary objective of a walkthrough is to understand the business process, understand the flow of transactions, identify the risk points, and then evaluate the design of controls and effectiveness of the control activities. So the steps to perform a walkthrough, there are 4 steps. First, we identify the process. While the client is explaining the business process to us, we have to identify if there is a reasonable possibility that there could be a risk of material misstatement in this business process. And then before we actually perform the walkthrough with the client where they show us the business process, we have to prepare for the walkthrough. So we need to have a meeting, a pre-walkthrough risk assessment meeting with the audit team, and identify information and relevant data elements, how the information flows through the system, and identify risk points beforehand, so that we are aware during the walkthrough that, right, at point A, I might be able to observe a potential risk. And then we conduct the walkthrough where we take detailed notes, ask probing questions to the client on how things are performed, and then document our evidences in the end once we have observed a business process end to end. So you might now ask, are walkthroughs performed for every business process? The answer to this question is no. Walkthroughs are only performed for a business process that may have a risk of material misstatement. And this possibility of material misstatement is defined when the audit team identifies that yes, risk might be present in the process. So during our initial interaction with the client, uh, it is summarized and documented where we can potentially find risks in the entire audit process or the IT systems involved. And if we identify any potential risks, those are the business processes that we observe and inspect during our walkthrough, not all the business processes. And finally, we come to identifying deficiencies and reporting deficiencies. So the formal definition is a deficiency in internal control, also referred to as a control deficiency, exists when the design or operation of a control does not allow entities, management, or employees to prevent, detect, or correct misstatements on a timely basis during the normal course of business. So for deficiencies, our job is to find which automated controls is linked to the GITC where the deficiency occurred, whether the general IT control, which is serving as a compensating control for that risk, is addressing the deficiency or not. If it is not addressing the deficiency, then what additional audit procedure is being performed by the client to remediate the deficiency, if they are in case doing it or not. And then the key success factors. So for overall success, IT audit associates should be prepared and positioned to provide input and ideas beyond just completing assigned tasks. And they should have a quality documentation that is easy to follow for a reviewer. And the main points here would be being prepared for internal trainings and internal meetings. During the walkthrough, not be afraid of asking questions and being as engaging as possible, and also being fully prepared before the walkthroughs to minimize redundant communication with the client afterwards. And I will explain why we should minimize redundant communication with the client, because it is one of the main drawbacks during an audit. So going to the challenges during audit, there are four. Number one is ineffective communication. So communication forms a huge part of an audit from the initial stages. If the client is not able to explain their business processes correctly, it will lead to the audit team not being able to audit them correctly. So, so for IT audit, the chief information security officer needs to be very competent in explaining how the business works, how the IT is tied to the finance aspect of the business, and accordingly, during our documentation, during that initial planning phase, we design our audit procedures. So if the initial communication is not effective, the consequent audit procedures might or might not be as effective. And the second challenge faced is limited staff resources dedicated to compliance. So this is what we face quite often in our industry, is that organizations do not have a dedicated staff to maintain compliance. And what this means is they do not have a dedicated staff to answer or help the audit personnel during the audit. What this means is we, during our walkthroughs or during our meetings, we have to find people who have to take time out of their day-to-day business activities to help us for our audit documentation. That means organizations usually do not have either an effective internal audit team or members or employees who are able to dedicate themselves during the audit to provide evidences. And that's why it is very, very, very important to, as an IT auditor or as an auditor in general, to prepare yourself before the walkthroughs to ask as many questions and cover as many points as possible. Because if you're going to go back to the client again and again and ask redundant questions, or say, oh, I forgot to ask you this during our last walkthrough, it will just frustrate them. And since they are already taking time out of their daily business activities, they might not be able to help you effectively. And that is why preparing before a walkthrough is very important. And then the third challenge is manual evidence collection. if the automated processes are not configured correctly, there is a lot of manual evidence collection involved and going through physical receipts or logs, which is quite time consuming. And number four challenge in IT audits is change management. As I said, IT is an ever changing industry. You cannot rely on the same controls month on month or year on year. So you have to make sure that if you are during your change management process, if you are changing a program, how it functions, or if you're changing your system entirely, you're following your policies to the dot and making sure that the end result is working as intended. Now, the opportunities in this industry, I'm going to.
Aman, please 2 more minutes to take some questions.
For sure. So this is the last slide left, and then we'll go to the questions. So the opportunities is future in IT audit. Let me just finish this quickly. IT audit is going to see a huge growth year on year, at least for the next 10 years. And the great thing is the shifting work culture. Ever since COVID, it is now not required to sit in an office to do your day-to-day job. 70 to 80% of an IT audit can be performed from the ease of your home. And then if I talk about educational requirement, if you have a background in IT, computer science, or information systems, if you have the CISA certification, CISSP system, or if you have past Big Four experience, and especially if you're enrolled in MISAM or MISIM program, you are fairly prepared to take on this role. And yes, now I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Aman, for this interesting talk. You gave us lots of information about the IT audit process. So it's time now to take some questions. Please, if you have any question, you can unmute yourself. Or you can, yes, Jeff, please go ahead.
A couple of things. One of the things that you mentioned is your audit process is affected by whether or not they have remote monitoring and management software. Is one of the pieces of that audit that you do is to assess the effectiveness, because not all RMM software is the same. So is an assessment done of that, number one? And number two, what's a typical security infrastructure look like for your clients? When you walk into a client, how many of your clients, would they have a dedicated system security professional? Would they have, are these certified people? Are these homegrown people? That type of thing. So that'd be very interesting to know that. If
Correct. So I'll answer your second question first. What we look for in an IT infrastructure is we fairly follow the standards set by NIST. NIST sets out standards for monitoring, password policy, user access provisioning, deprovisioning, right? So that's what we follow. And then what I have observed during my audits is that the bigger clients, they are fairly prepared to monitor these activities. They have employees or supervisors in place to monitor such activities. But for some of the clients who are using legacy systems from, let's say, 90s or the early 2000s, they find it fairly hard to incorporate the new security measures or change their IT systems. So they rely on the expertise of an employee, let's say an employee X who has 15 years of experience in that legacy system to work out the kinks. And this is, so every audit is different. It is based on our proficiency, how we understand their business processes. Like every IT system is different, how we understand it, and then how we map it to the industry benchmarks that is given to us by the NIST framework. So whether it's a new system or an old system, we have to map them to the NIST framework and see if they are following the security procedures correctly or not.
Good. So please go ahead, Sue.
Hi, thanks for that great presentation. I have two questions for you. The first relates to some work that I do in my personal life to chair audit and finance committees for various not-for-profits.
Okay.
I've been amazed at the differences in prices that are quoted by various audit firms when they're bidding on our work. So it makes me curious to know, how do audit firms go about putting together a costing when, as you've pointed out, you've not yet done a lot of the walkthroughs, the detailed discoveries and things like that? That's one of my questions. The second question is relating to my role as an instructor here at Concordia. I'm understanding that a lot of the audit firms are intrigued by data analytics, but also a little bit nervous. It just seems like we're not fully embracing the capacity of data analytics. I'm assuming that that's because of a concern with liability, but I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts.
All right. So number one would be, like, although I'm not involved in the bidding process because I'm still a consultant, that starts from manager and above. But what I feel is, like, once a tender passes, each of the big four, they are fairly close to the bid that they offer. The only difference is the amount of assurance they are providing. So their assurance might differ by, let's say, the amount of systems that they're covering or the departments that they're covering. That can affect the pricing of the bids given out by the big four. And your second question for data analytics is, the reason why there is this hesitancy is because, first off, it is hard to find someone with a good expertise in this field, because when you are an auditor, you're in a position to give an opinion. And if you are not competent enough to provide an opinion, it might not lead to like a good customer or client satisfaction. And it can, affect your future relation with the client. So data analytics, if you have good expertise, if you have good employees with vast amount of experience, then only a big four. But it's not a problem in big four, but smaller entities, they do have this problem. They try not to put their step in this field because of lack of experience, I feel, with the current workforce.
Thanks, Aman. One last question from Harry Shiel. Please go ahead.
Hi, Rishil.
Hi, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
So give a brief introduction. Like, I will be an incoming student for the MISAM program for
Right.
the upcoming fall intake.
Right.
So let's just say that I'm starting off as an IT auditor.
Right.
What would be the first steps that you would recommend? Like some advice for someone who's starting out.
So first off, I would recommend you to start preparing for either CISSP or CISA certification. Secondly, we also have our ITACs Edmonton chapter, and Concordia is, like, students from Concordia actively participate in that. So you can ask your professors how you can be a part of the ITACs community here, and then attend the networking events, because you will gain a lot of information on the current industry trends and what kind of expertise you need to excel in this field or in auditing in general.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you, Aman. Thank you all for being with us today. It was a great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Jet, for the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aman. Well,
Thanks,
Aman. Well done. Thank you.